Quad 66. Alright, here's the built-up quad. These are those TuneRC products that I did the prior two videos about. You've already seen this quad fly, but I wanted to show you how this looked built up. So this is their 3-inch frame. It's got their Poly F405 board. It's a 2 to 4S board, and it's got their 1104 3600 kV motors. I did try this on a couple different props. It did like these Nazguls. These are Nazgul 3020s. And it did like the GenFan 3016s. I tried it on the Emax Avan or Avia 3-inch props, and it didn't really like those. I'm not really sure why. In terms of the build, I just threw on a Ubidrone BI canopy, and I had a camera sitting around I have a bunch of these one LDARC 199C, and then for see where it's hiding in there. For the receiver on this side, over on this side, there's the receiver. I've got the little Happy Model EP2 receiver, and for the VTX I used the nameless RC VTX. And it built up kind of nice and tight. The biggest challenge for me was this issue here. So when you use the metal screw with the metal nut, that gives you a very nice interface here where this kind of locks down really tight, but then the hard part then is screwing down the BI canopy onto it. I don't typically often build this way, so it took me a little bit of tinkering in terms of loosening up that screw or that nut enough so they could spin while I brought this down and then tighten them all down together. To get enough camera tilt, I basically took one nylon nut and put it on top of the gummy there. You can kind of maybe sort of see that there, just to lean the camera back a little bit more. With their gummies and their steel nuts, there is not a whole lot of room between the board and the frame. It is really close. It's clearly not so close. I didn't short anything out, but just for kind of peace of mind, I would recommend just putting on another nylon nut on top or something, just to give you a little bit more room, or a little spacer washer or something else. Otherwise, there's really not a whole lot to go over here. I'll show you the weights. I think I already mentioned the weight. But this built up, and this is with these Nazgul props. It's pretty similar weight with the GenFans. So you can see 54 grams. Adds the 4S battery, and I only flew it on this 380 4S, and that brings our weight up to 96 grams. The battery alone weighs 42 grams, and I did also buy a 450 size 4S, and to be honest, I just didn't even bother flying this one because weight-wise, this was already more weight than I really wanted to be carrying in terms of punch out and things like that. So I didn't even really bother with this battery because we were already kind of at the limits of the all-up weight for what these motors will realistically, kind of put up in the air in any type of reasonably fun way. It is an easy quad to fly. It's just kind of a little bit lacking in terms of the sheer punch out, especially for kind of a 4S 3-inch build. It tuned up pretty well, and so now I'm going to switch on over to show you the tune in Betaflight, and then I'll pull up the Blackbox logs and show you those, and show you that the tune actually looks pretty good. Down below, I'm going to put a link to a file for my diff all off of this. I haven't put a preset into Betaflight. I need to kind of go through, and on the current release Betaflight, I need to redo the presets, and that's going to take me a little bit of work before I work through a backlog of stuff there. But let's jump over to Betaflight and the Blackbox. Here we are now with the quad plugged in on Betaflight, and going through it, I'm actually reminded of an issue I had with the build that I forgot about, and I'll mention it now. So I believe TuneRC has it set up so that normally you're going to have your serial RX on UART4, and you can see how I have mine here on UART2. I do have my VTX on UART1, which is kind of their default, And the reason that I moved the RX up from UART4 to UART2 was that I couldn't get it to work. So I tried the EP2 receiver and I couldn't get it to work on UART4, but I was able to get it to work on UART2. I did message with TuneRC a little bit about it, and basically their sort of answer was there's some things you could check, which was a little bit beyond my sort of skill level to check certain things. And they said, well, at the end of the day, you've got a bunch of UARTs, just use another one, and I did. And so for me, that's fine. That's no big deal. However, if you are using, multiple things that you want to have all these UARTs available, that may not be okay for you. The more concerning part about that to me is that TuneRC normally has been pretty good, pretty solid on the quality, and it's a little bit disappointing to see something not quite working 100% the way I expect it to. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this board. Otherwise, configuration-wise, I kind of did my usual stuff. So, well, other than with the BMI 270, you're going to be on 3.2, 3.2. Like I always do, I turn off my accelerometer and everything else that I don't need to free up as much CPU processor speed as possible. Nothing else too exciting here. In terms of PID tuning, stuff does get a little bit interesting here. I'll walk through that, but for the filter, I used what I use now. This is kind of my default filter strategy. So what I do is I push both my sliders all the way to 2. That's the least amount of filtering. I turn off gyro low pass 1 and just leave gyro low pass 2 on. On my RPM filters, I use 3 harmonics, and my minimum I set somewhere around 100 RPM. For my dynamic notch filters, I use 2 and a pretty wide Q of 300, and I give it a range from around 125 to 600. This you could potentially decrease, and I'll show you in the black box that I'm not really seeing a whole lot of resonance peaks for this to go after, so you could probably speed up your, decrease your latency by removing one or potentially both of these dynamic notch filters. Getting into the PIDs themselves, obviously you want to make sure that you have your settings over here for feed forward relative setup for your particular system, in my case Express LRS. Didn't really mess with much over here other than using a little bit more thrust linearization. I used 30% thrust linearization, and I've used kind of my now default of 35 for my dynamic idle. In terms of the PIDs, nothing crazy here. You can see we kind of bumped some things up a little bit, but not really a whole lot. That's really not that far away from Betaflight defaults. The main thing I'm doing is I turn off my dynamic damping. I kind of want that consistent D, and so I just move that to 0. And what that does for us is it makes sure that your low and high D is just the same, so you just have one D value. But as I said, I'll have the diff all below, so you don't necessarily have to try and pause and write all this stuff down. But you can see that my sliders pretty close to kind of in the middle. Nothing too crazy there. One of the things I do under the hood, which I'll actually get to that after one more point. One other thing I did is I messed with the TPA here a little bit. So with the TPA, I did change it here a little bit. I brought my TPA down from, I think the default is like 0.65. I brought it down to 0.5. And I'll show you in the black box what that is. But basically what I'm trying to do is decrease some of my P oscillations at high throttle by bringing down that TPA. Similarly, that's kind of what the thrust linearization does here as well. You're sort of doing the same thing in a way with two different parameters, which is, in my mind, a little bit sub-ideal, but they kind of do something a little bit different. So where thrust linearization, what it does is it changes all, it changes the PI and D because you're just changing the thrust characteristic versus in your TPA is leaving I term alone. It's only bringing down your P and D. So a little bit different there. The one thing under the hood, actually two things under the hood, let me show you those. One of those is my PID sum. Because we use pretty high values, you got to bump up the PID sum limit. I bump it up to 1,000. The default is 500, and that just basically prevents you from saturating, from hitting this 500. It gives you room so that your PID can go up to where it needs to. And I do check in the Blackbox to make sure that we're not oversaturating the motors regularly. And with 1,000, I found that that has not been a problem. The other thing I do here in the CLI is I adjust my RPM filter queue. And I narrow it down a little bit. I narrow it to 750. So default's 500, and I narrow it to 750. That gives a little bit, it doesn't clean up the noise quite as well, but it decreases the latency by having a narrower, basically gives you a narrower notch. Now, what that means, how this translates into the black box. So first thing I'll show you is just kind of a couple of snap rolls and stuff, and I'll show you the set point tracking. So what you can see here is that we are jumping right on set point, holding it really well, staying nice and stable through here, and then decreasing here. This is really, really very, very good looking snap roll in terms of your set point tracking. So in red is your gyro, in yellow is your set point. So yellow is what my stick is telling the quad to do, red is what the quad is actually doing. The one problem spot that you can spot here that may drive the people, like if you're trying to film in HD, you may not, you may see this, but there's a little bit of wobble. You can see right here at the end of the snap roll. And you could potentially clean that up just by pushing your master slider up a little bit more. Just giving a little bit more P and D should clean that up, should take it out. But overall, you can see, several snap rolls looking pretty good. And then we go over to our twitch moves. Scroll over, find some twitch moves. And here we can see the twitch moves look excellent as well. So we're just kind of losing it a little bit there. And this is really kind of an artifact, really and truly. You don't really fly like this where you kind of twitch it back and forth. But this is pretty good tracking through these twitch moves there. In terms of like things I did leave in a little bit, so I mentioned this little bit, you could probably get rid of that by pushing your P and D up a little bit, but the problem that you're going to generate then is going to be this P oscillation here. Let's see where it brings out the most. Okay, probably see it the best here. So you can see on the gyros, that's your roll and that's your pitch. As we get up into the high throttle, we do get a little oscillation. Now I'm magnifying this. I'm using my expo. You can see without the expo. So this actually sounds, it's really hard to hear. You might hear just the slightest hint of something here. And you could probably get rid of this by getting even more aggressive with your TPA or getting even more aggressive with your thrust linearization. The thing about that, though, is somewhere along the line, somewhere in between. So, for example, this is kind of hover over here. Mid throttle up to full throttle. You can watch the little props, going faster and faster. Somewhere you're going to create a problem. So if you maximize down here and you maximize down here, somewhere in here something's going to go a little funny. And so my thought on it is get it to where it doesn't bother you anymore, and don't try and push it past there just because you can see something in the black box, because if you try and push it past that and totally get rid of it in the black box, as I said, you're gonna create some kind of problem elsewhere. And similar thing, I think, over here with this little wobble after the snap roll. Again, we can really kind of like try and push this and optimize it by either moving up our P and D and then cutting the TPA or using more thrust linearization. But again, you're going to create some problems somewhere else. So my thought on this is when I'm flying with my analog, I can't see this at all and I can't feel it. So I'm just going to leave it there because I'd rather have like kind of a minor known problem than create a larger, kind of harder to spot problem somewhere else. All right, so that's the tune. That's how the tune looks. Let's take a look at the noise. So let's pull up a couple extra fields here. Now we're going to add in our gyro scaled. So let's get gyro scaled on the roll. Let's get gyro scaled on the pitch. And let's get in some D term here. So 2 more fields. Let's get our D term roll and D term pitch. Okay. So now what I do is let's turn off our smoothing. So I always like to look at my D term, and you can see the D terms here. So there's a D term on pitch, there's a D term on roll. I always like looking at these, just kind of scanning through. And what I'm looking for with D term is I actually want to see a little bit of this. I call these like kind of these little D term blooms, where you kind of see this bloom of D term noise coming up. And if I don't see this, I know I can push the D term higher. This is not enough to really generate much in the way of any kind of like motor heat or anything like that. And if I don't see it at all, it means I'm leaving some performance probably on the table. Now, how much of this your quad is going to tolerate obviously depends on the voltage, the motors, the props, everything else. But for these micros, this is kind of generally a level that I'm okay with. Now, looking at some of the plots, we're going to start with the gyro scaled. Hopefully it'll make a plot for me. Yeah, so here's our gyro scaled. And so we're starting on, let's start on roll. And so a couple things we want to look for here. So one of the things we want to do is we want to make sure down low here, kind of in this 100-ish hertz range, you know, do we see any problems here? Do we see any peaks coming up here? Do we see any, you know, frame resonance? And in this case, this all looks pretty clean down here. Where we see is our noise kind of come up through here. So this is like probably like 170 hertz, and then sort of petering out here by, you know, what is that going to be, like, I don't know, 400 or so. But we don't see any major problems here, and we can see all our good commands as signal there, and the ratio between how much we have commanded in versus our noise that's coming through, this actually looks pretty good to me. We also want to look at this on this waterfall plot, and what you can see is on this frame, most of our noise here is really, it's motor band dominant, where we can see this motor band here, and we really don't see any frame resonance. There's no, you know, kind of like things coming up from the frame resonance. The frame resonance will look more like a vertical band coming up and down. And very importantly, down here where we're not filtering, this all looks pretty good and clean. So it looks good. Let's go over to the pitch. I'll just show you the pitch as well. Okay. And basically on the pitch axis, similar story here, where it looks pretty clean down below the filters. And there's really not a whole lot getting through on the pitch. That looks pretty darn good. So that's going to be a combination of, well, this is going to be the frame doing its job. So when we're looking at gyro scaled, this means that not much is coming through, and then we don't see any problems from the gyro there. Looking at our waterfall plot, again, we can see this is mostly kind of motor band noise, and no obvious frame resonance there. So now let's amplify. Let's go ahead and look at our D term. So basically with our D term, what we're doing is we're taking whatever noise is coming through the gyro scaled, and then we filter that, and whatever's left over, now we're just going to magnify it with the D term. And as you can see, obviously this looks, you know, we're amplifying what was already there, but nothing looks terrible. And this looks totally reasonable to me. I don't see any problem spots. There's no big peaks here, especially down low. And when we come over here to the frequency versus throttle, we can see we're still dominated by our motor bands, and we don't see any ugly frame resonance. Let's just finish up with our pitch D term. Of course, the computer's moving slow, but pitch D term, you know, similar story where we're not really, you know, obviously we took whatever was left, whatever got through the filters, and amplified it, but we don't see any problems. And looking at our frequency versus throttle, we see most of it still in the motor bands. Maybe a little bit more background haze here, but overall, to me, this looks good without any problems. All right, so I think the take home on this is both the board itself and the quad, in terms of tuning and noise and all the rest of it, are both working together well. And although maybe it's not the most powerful thing on the planet, it's a quad that actually flies really well and is really easy to control, and doesn't have any major resonance problems that I can find. So looks pretty good. So I'll leave you on that. All right, till next time. Cheers.